Long before email fraud, thousands lost money to a single letter. It claimed a wealthy prisoner was secretly held in Spain. It promised access to a hidden fortune. All it required was a small payment to secure his release. Lawyers replied. Merchants invested. Respectable citizens transferred funds. The story felt plausible. The reward seemed enormous. The risk appeared minimal. This was not coincidence. It was one of the earliest structured financial scams in modern history, and its blueprint still appears in inboxes today. This is the Spanish prisoner scam. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Europe was politically unstable. Spain, in particular, carried an image of secrecy and internal turmoil. The Napoleonic Wars disrupted monarchies across the continent. Between 1808 and 1814, Spain endured invasion and dynastic crisis. Royal authority appeared fragile. Aristocratic imprisonment was not uncommon. Political prisoners were a visible reality of the era. Rumors of nobles confined in remote fortresses circulated widely. Communication moved slowly. Verification was difficult. Colonial wealth narratives amplified plausibility. Spain's empire in the Americas had generated immense treasure. Gold and silver shipments from Mexico and Peru were well documented. Stories of hidden fortunes were common in European imagination. Inheritance disputes frequently crossed borders. Legal systems were fragmented. Records were not centrally accessible. Secrecy was believable in that environment. Discretion was culturally valued among elites. Private correspondence was normal for sensitive matters. Banking networks were still developing. International transfers required intermediaries. Aristocratic titles carried weight. A claim involving nobility signaled status. Status implied credibility. Wealth implied motive. If a prisoner existed, ransom seemed logical. If wealth existed, assistance seemed profitable. Political detention created urgency. Urgency reduced scrutiny. Spain's geographic distance reinforced mystery. Most recipients had never visited Spain. Few could confirm prison records. Newspapers often printed sensational aristocratic stories. Public appetite for intrigue was strong. Scandals involving courts and inheritance were common. Letters carried seals and formal language. Formal language signaled legitimacy. Legitimacy reduced suspicion. The narrative aligned with known political instability. It aligned with known colonial wealth. It aligned with known aristocratic secrecy. Nothing in the story contradicted the historical moment. The scenario felt improbable, but not impossible. Improbable stories can still be credible when context supports them. The letter did not invent chaos. It borrowed from existing uncertainty. It used political instability as scaffolding. Structural takeaway. A scam succeeds when it aligns with believable historical conditions. The Spanish prisoner letter followed a structured template. It opened with a claim of secrecy. The writer identified himself as a trusted intermediary. He described a wealthy individual imprisoned unjustly in Spain. The prisoner was often portrayed as noble or politically connected. A hidden inheritance was introduced early in the narrative. The inheritance was substantial. Sometimes it involved millions in gold. Sometimes it involved bonds or estates. The fortune could not be accessed publicly. Access required discretion. Discretion required a foreign partner. The recipient was framed as uniquely trustworthy. Exclusivity increased engagement. The letter emphasized confidentiality. It warned against informing authorities. It framed secrecy as protection. Legal obstacles were described in detail. Documentation was said to be incomplete. Government corruption was implied. A small financial barrier was introduced. The barrier was procedural. Funds were needed for legal representation. Funds were needed for transfer documentation. Funds were needed for bribes or administrative clearance. The requested amount appeared minor compared to the promised reward. The ratio favored participation. The writer promised a percentage of the fortune. Percentages ranged between 10 and 30%. The reward was structured as partnership. Partnership implied legitimacy. The letter often included formal titles. Titles created authority. Authority reduced skepticism. Handwritten signatures added personalization. Personalization increased trust. The tone was restrained rather than emotional. Restraint signaled seriousness. The story was detailed enough to appear specific. Specificity implied authenticity. Dates were occasionally included. Names of prisons or officials were referenced. These details were rarely verifiable. Verifiability was not required. The recipient was asked to respond quickly. Urgency limited deliberation. The letter closed with reassurance. Reassurance framed risk as minimal. Minimal risk justified action. The entire structure balanced hope with plausibility. It did not promise instant wealth. It promised controlled opportunity. The design was intentional. Structural takeaway. Exclusivity and urgency create commitment before verification occurs. The advance fee mechanism was the core innovation of the Spanish prisoner scam. The requested payment was deliberately small. It was framed as procedural rather than speculative. The money was not described as an investment. It was described as assistance. Legal costs were the most common justification. The intermediary claimed a lawyer required immediate funds. Sometimes the excuse involved notarization fees. Sometimes it involved customs or transfer taxes. The expense always appeared temporary. The amount was minor relative to the promised fortune. This ratio shaped perception. A small payment lowered resistance. Lower resistance increased compliance. The first transfer was a psychological threshold. Once crossed, commitment increased. Commitment altered judgment. Recipients began to defend their decision internally. Follow-up letters introduced additional complications. New documents were required. New administrative barriers appeared. Each barrier justified another payment. The payments escalated gradually. Escalation prevented shock. Every request was presented as the final obstacle. The phrase, "one last requirement," appeared frequently. Finality encouraged continuation. Sunk cost bias began to operate. Previous payments made withdrawal difficult. Admitting error would require reputational loss. Many recipients were professionals. Professionals protect their perceived competence. Silence replaced admission. Further payments were rationalized as recovery attempts. Recovery logic replaced objective assessment. The intermediary maintained formal tone. Formal tone masked manipulation. Delay between letters increased anticipation. Anticipation reinforced hope. Hope sustained compliance. Occasional partial documentation was sent. Documents appeared official but unverifiable. Seals and stamps created illusion of progress. Progress justified patience. Patience enabled continued extraction. The mechanism did not rely on force. It relied on incremental consent. Consent accumulated into loss. Structural takeaway. Small initial commitments enable repeated extraction through psychological escalation. The Spanish prisoner scam operated long before electronic communication. It relied entirely on physical mail. Delivery times ranged from days to weeks. Delay created anticipation. Anticipation intensified emotional investment. Targets were not randomly selected. Letters were often directed at merchants. Merchants were accustomed to international transactions. Cross-border payments did not appear unusual. Lawyers were another frequent target. Lawyers understood inheritance law. Legal language did not intimidate them. In fact, it engaged them. The letter used formal structure. Paragraphs were carefully organized. Language was restrained. Excess emotion was avoided. Professional tone implied legitimacy. Titles were used consistently. Honorifics reinforced hierarchy. Hierarchy encouraged deference. The writer positioned himself as subordinate but informed. This dynamic flattered the recipient. Flattery increases receptivity. The recipient was described as uniquely capable. Capability implied responsibility. Responsibility justified involvement. The story blended greed with moral framing. Helping a prisoner sounded virtuous. Profit became secondary. Moral cover reduced internal conflict. Internal conflict slows fraud. The scam minimized visible risk. No physical meeting was required. No travel was necessary. Only correspondence. The letter appeared personal. Handwriting varied slightly. This variation implied individuality. Individuality reduced suspicion of duplication. Recipients believed the opportunity was exclusive. Exclusivity created urgency. Urgency shortened deliberation. The absence of technology limited fact-checking. Verification required international inquiry. Few undertook that effort. The scam succeeded without digital tools. It relied on structural persuasion, structural takeaway. Social engineering predates technology and depends on structured persuasion, not medium. By the mid-19th century, the Spanish prisoner scam had crossed borders. It moved from Spain into France, from France into Britain, from Britain into the United States. Migration followed trade routes. Where merchants operated, letters followed. Postal networks expanded during the 1800s. Improved delivery increased scalability. Steamships reduced transatlantic transit times. Faster mail enabled faster fraud cycles. The script adapted slightly in each region. Spanish prisons became Caribbean fortresses. Aristocrats became political dissidents. Hidden gold became railway bonds. The structure remained constant. A detained figure, a concealed fortune, a trusted intermediary, a small procedural fee. American newspapers began publishing warnings in the 1880s. Some labeled it the Spanish prisoner confidence trick. Public advisories described identical language patterns. Despite warnings, letters continued to circulate. Fraud thrives despite exposure. Exposure rarely eliminates structure. The scam required minimal infrastructure. No office was necessary. No employees were required. Only paper, ink, and postage. Profit margins were high. Losses were distributed among victims. Distributed loss reduced collective outrage. Each victim believed the mistake was personal. Private embarrassment prevented public reporting. Limited reporting preserved longevity. Fraudsters refined their scripts. Language became more precise. Amounts were calibrated carefully. Too large discouraged response. Too small reduced payoff. Balance optimized return. Victims were staggered across regions. Geographic dispersion reduced coordinated awareness. The scam spread because it was portable. It required no physical presence. It relied on narrative and patience. Narrative travels easily. Patience multiplies opportunity. The structure could be replicated infinitely. Replication required no innovation, only repetition. By the late 19th century, variants were documented across continents. The scam survived because it adapted to communication speed. Its logic was independent of geography. Structural takeaway. Simple fraud structures scale across borders when they require only narrative and minimal infrastructure. One of the most persistent questions is why intelligent people responded. Many victims were educated. Some were lawyers. Others were merchants accustomed to risk evaluation. The scam did not target ignorance, it targeted incentive. The promised fortune was large but not absurd. It was framed as plausible inheritance. Inheritance disputes were common in the 19th century. Political detention made assets inaccessible. Inaccessibility justified outside assistance. Recipients could imagine the scenario. Imagination reduces skepticism. The requested payment was small relative to the reward. The ratio appeared favorable. Risk seemed limited. Limited risk encourages experimentation. Many recipients believed they were helping an unjustly imprisoned noble. Moral framing softened greed. Greed alone can trigger suspicion. Greed combined with virtue feels justified. Recipients could tell themselves they were assisting. Assistance framed payment as ethical. The intermediary's tone reinforced seriousness. Seriousness reduced perception of manipulation. The scam exploited overconfidence. Professionals believed they could detect deception. Belief in competence reduces caution. Caution requires humility. Humility was rarely activated. The correspondence appeared private. Privacy increases perceived control. Control reduces perceived vulnerability. Some victims believed they possessed insider information. Insider status creates exclusivity. Exclusivity increases emotional investment. Emotional investment clouds objectivity. The process unfolded slowly. Slow pace allowed gradual commitment. Gradual commitment normalized payment. Each transfer felt recoverable. Recovery logic replaced exit logic. Victims anticipated future reward. Anticipation sustains engagement. Hope delays recognition of loss. When doubt surfaced, prior payments influenced decision-making. Sunk costs discourage withdrawal. Withdrawal would require admitting error. Admitting error threatens identity. Identity preservation often outweighs financial prudence. The scam did not overpower intelligence, it redirected it. Recipients applied intelligence to justify participation. Justification sustained compliance. Structural takeaway: intelligence does not prevent fraud when incentives align with ego and controlled optimism. Once the initial payment was made, the structure shifted. The recipient was no longer a prospect, he was now committed. Commitment altered the tone of correspondence. The intermediary expressed gratitude. Gratitude reinforced partnership. Shortly after, a new obstacle emerged. The obstacle appeared procedural. A missing document was cited. A government stamp was required. A signature was incomplete. Each complication justified another small fee. The amount increased slightly. Increase was gradual. Gradual escalation avoided shock. Every request was framed as temporary. The phrase "final requirement" appeared repeatedly. Finality encouraged persistence. The intermediary maintained consistency. Consistency implied legitimacy. Occasionally, partial documentation was provided. These documents appeared official. Seals and stamps were carefully drawn. Names of minor officials were invented. Specificity created realism. Realism sustained belief. The recipient began anticipating the fortune. Anticipation reinforced patience. Patience enabled delay. Delay increased emotional investment. Emotional investment increased sunk cost. With each payment, withdrawal became harder. Harder withdrawal increased vulnerability. Some recipients began to suspect. Suspicion triggered reassurance letters. Reassurance letters were longer. Longer letters included more detail. Detail distracted from core fraud. Time passed between exchanges. Time reduced immediate alarm. Victims explained delays to themselves. Self-explanation stabilized commitment. Occasionally, small refunds were promised. Refund promises restored hope. Hope prolonged participation. If a recipient hesitated, urgency increased. Urgency reframed delay as threat. The fortune could be confiscated. The prisoner could be transferred. Opportunity could disappear. Fear replaced doubt. Fear motivates action. The loop continued until resistance emerged. Resistance ended profitability. When payments stopped, correspondence ceased. Silence replaced persuasion. The structure required no confrontation. It relied on repetition. Structural takeaway: fraud persists through controlled escalation, reassurance, and the strategic use of urgency. Legal systems in the 19th century were poorly equipped to confront cross-border fraud. Jurisdiction ended at national boundaries. The Spanish prisoner letters often originated outside the victim's country. Tracing authorship was difficult. Postal anonymity protected the sender. False names were common. Addresses were temporary. Proving intent required evidence. Evidence was rarely preserved. Victims were often embarrassed. Embarrassment reduced reporting. Reduced reporting limited prosecution. When cases did reach court, intent was contested. Defendants claimed misunderstanding. They framed correspondence as speculative partnership. Speculation is not always illegal. Fraud requires proof of deliberate deception. Deliberate deception was difficult to demonstrate. Documentation could be ambiguous. Ambiguity benefits the accused. Courts required clear evidence of false representation. Letters often avoided direct lies. They implied rather than stated. Implication complicates prosecution. Cross-border cooperation was limited. Extradition treaties were inconsistent. Enforcement agencies lacked coordination. International fraud investigations were slow. Time favored the fraudster. Even successful prosecutions were localized. Localized enforcement did not eliminate the structure. New operators adopted the same script elsewhere. Newspapers published warnings. Warnings increased awareness. Awareness reduced some participation, but warnings did not dismantle incentives. The core mechanism remained intact. Legal deterrence was uneven. Punishment required identification. Identification required confession or documentation. Most operators avoided traceable records. Paper trails were minimal. Fraudsters changed names frequently. Mobility protected continuity. Institutions reacted after losses occurred. Reaction is slower than invention. Law evolves incrementally. Fraud adapts quickly. The Spanish prisoner scam exposed institutional limits. Institutions depend on evidence. Evidence depends on reporting. Reporting depends on willingness. Willingness was constrained by shame. Shame preserved the fraud's survival. Structural takeaway: institutional limits allow cross-border fraud to persist when proof and reporting are fragmented. By the early 20th century, communication technology began to change. The telegraph compressed distance. Messages that once required weeks now required hours. Fraud adapted accordingly. The Spanish prisoner narrative did not disappear. It accelerated. Telegraph operators transmitted urgent financial appeals. Wire transfers replaced mailed coins. The structure remained consistent. A detained individual, a restricted fortune, an intermediary requesting assistance. Advance fees moved through banking channels. Speed altered victim experience. Shorter delays increased pressure. Pressure reduced reflection time. Fraudsters adjusted tone. Urgency intensified. Requests became time-sensitive. Deadlines were introduced. Failure to act quickly risked losing the fortune. Telegrams conveyed authority. Official language carried institutional weight. Recipients perceived urgency as legitimacy. Legitimacy encouraged compliance. The scam integrated new infrastructure. Banks process transfers without evaluating narrative. Financial systems transmit funds. They do not verify stories. Verification remained the responsibility of the sender. Responsibility was rarely exercised. Fraud scripts became standardized. Templates circulated among operators. Language patterns repeated across cases. Investigators began documenting similarities. Similarity revealed structure. Structure revealed design. Design revealed intentional fraud.
Despite exposure, variance persisted. Telegraph systems increased reach. Reach expanded victim pool. Expansion increased profitability. Profitability incentivized replication. Replication required no innovation, only adaptation to medium. The Spanish prisoner scam became advance fee fraud. Advance fee fraud became transferable across platforms. The medium changed, the incentive did not. The narrative evolved with infrastructure. Infrastructure multiplied scale. Scale increased impact. Impact ensured survival. Structural takeaway. When communication accelerates, fraud structures accelerate with it.
In the late 20th century, the structure migrated again. Email replaced telegraph. Distribution costs fell to nearly zero. The Spanish prisoner narrative reappeared in digital form. The imprisoned aristocrat became a displaced official. Spain was replaced with other distant nations. Hidden inheritance remained central. Large dormant bank accounts replaced colonial treasure. The intermediary became a government insider. The fee remained small relative to the reward. The script was mass distributed. Scale shifted from targeted to broadcast. Thousands of messages were sent simultaneously. Most recipients ignored them. A small percentage responded. Fraud economics depend on percentages. Low response rates can still generate profit. Automation increased volume. Volume increased opportunity. Personalization became simulated. Names were inserted automatically. Formal tone remained intact. Authority was implied through titles. Confidentiality was emphasized. Urgency was reinforced. Banking instructions were provided digitally. Wire transfers replaced mailed drafts. Payment platforms diversified. Advance fee fraud matured into global industry. The term 419 became associated with these schemes. Section 419 of the Nigerian Criminal Code addressed fraud. Media coverage amplified awareness. Awareness did not eliminate participation. New narratives emerged: Civil War compensation claims, oil contract transfers, diplomatic immunity scenarios. Each version preserved core structure: emotional story, exclusive opportunity, small upfront payment, reassurance and repetition, escalation through additional fees, termination when victim resists. Technology reduced effort. Effort reduction increased scale. Scale increased visibility. Visibility normalized exposure. Exposure reduced stigma. Yet participation continued. The digital mutation proved a simple principle: medium evolves, structure persists. Structural takeaway: technology changes distribution, but the advance fee structure remains constant. The Spanish prisoner scam reveals a durable structural blueprint. It begins with an emotional narrative. The narrative establishes injustice. Injustice creates sympathy. Sympathy lowers skepticism. Next comes exclusivity. The recipient is positioned as uniquely trusted. Trust creates obligation. Obligation encourages response. A concealed fortune is introduced. The fortune establishes incentive. Incentive activates imagination. Imagination reduces critical distance. A small procedural payment is requested. The payment appears rational. Rational appearance minimizes perceived risk. Once paid, commitment forms. Commitment alters evaluation. Follow-up obstacles are introduced. Each obstacle justifies another fee. Fees escalate gradually. Gradual escalation prevents alarm. Reassurance accompanies every request. Reassurance restores hope. Hope sustains engagement. Delay is framed as progress. Progress masks stagnation. Sunk costs accumulate. Accumulation discourages withdrawal. Withdrawal threatens identity. Identity preservation prolongs participation. When resistance increases, urgency intensifies. Urgency reframes hesitation as danger. Fear replaces doubt. If payments cease, silence signals collapse. The blueprint is simple. It does not depend on geography. It does not depend on era. It depends on incentive alignment.
Hope plus exclusivity equals engagement. Engagement plus small commitment equals compliance. Compliance plus escalation equals extraction. Extraction continues until refusal. Refusal ends profitability. The structure can operate in letters. It can operate in telegrams. It can operate in email. It can operate in messaging apps. Medium changes. Human incentives remain stable. The Spanish prisoner scam was not primitive. It was foundational. Its architecture defines modern advance fee fraud. Technology evolves. Human psychology does not. Structural takeaway. Fraud endures because narrative, exclusivity, and incremental commitment exploit stable human incentives.